the At Sea podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. We get to dive into some questions this week that I'm looking forward to. After years of doing an interview-style podcast, which we will potentially eventually get back to, we'll see, talking with folks whose work I felt addressed the questions, the considerations, the concerns, and obstacles to living a full and flourishing life. We've changed the format of the podcast to make it more of a direct conversation, so that you float questions at me and I do my best to address or reflect on those things. So this week we're going to hit two questions. The one is a personal question about Sabbath keeping and about rest and about the building of a Sabbath that happened over Instagram and was public. The other one that we'll get to has to do with I guess this is it's a soapbox I end up standing on. It's a soapbox I readily and happily climb up on occasion that about deconstruction and what is meant by that and what we mean by that. I'm going to get to that second because I feel like I will get lost in it if I don't. So the first question about Sabbath keeping was how to build and how to design a Sabbath day. And there's so many reasons I love this question, mostly because it provides me an opportunity to talk a little bit of my own history. So if you've read the book, Sacred Strides, early on in the book, I talk about my entrance into Sabbath keeping. And I try to be somewhat self-deprecating about that entrance in, and that I didn't start practicing rest, didn't start practicing Sabbath because it was the right thing to do and I knew how to do it. It was an experiment. It was a thing I tried. It was a thing I wasn't good at. And since then, it's not that I've gotten particularly better at designing a Sabbath day or better at Sabbathing. It's that I've become more comfortable with the practice of Sabbath keeping, and as a practice, Sabbath keeping, I've become more comfortable with and aware of the questions Sabbath keeping asks me about how I'm living. Let me dig in a little bit deeper. Right now, in my 50th year of life, what my Sabbath looks like is very different from what my Sabbath looked like 10 years ago and what I was doing with my rest days. That's because my soul is different. I'm different. My circumstances are different. In fact, my Sabbath days now look different than they did even 2 years ago. And the reason that's the case is the Sabbath for me, and I think I hope this gets to be generally true for a lot of us. The Sabbath is not this kind of monolith practice, or not monolith practice. It's not this fundamental list of achievements that on the Sabbath we do this. Instead, the Sabbath gets to be an opportunity for you and I to hit pause on the life we're living and ask our souls questions like, how are you doing and what do you need? And then regularly answer that question. Which is to say, there are definitely times when I've set aside time on a Sabbath day, for a Sabbath day. I've set aside the Sabbath day and I have kind of a loose plan. And I'm going to read this book. I'm going to take a long run, or I'm going to, and I get to the day, and what I discover is I start to execute my plan. It's not landing. The thing I've gotten better at over time is holding that loosely. When I have practiced Sabbath poorly, it's because I've held to my plan regardless of whether or not it is having that positive effect of creating rest and facilitating peace and stillness and a presence to myself and to God. I would hold to the plan. This was the plan. We're going to stick with it. The practice, the real discipline practice of Sabbath, is to do it regularly. The practice of Sabbath doesn't mean like there are specific things that I'm going to do, and if I don't do those things, I haven't Sabbath. The real discipline of Sabbath is to do it regularly. once I've put that in place, as I put that in place and I practice Sabbath regularly, it frees me up to experiment, to play, and to pay attention to my soul. What do I need? How am I living? How do I feel? What's going on between me and myself, my subconscious and conscious mind? What's happening between God and me, and what do I on this day need in order to let the goodness of my life catch up with me, in order to actually pay some concentrated attention to God? What do I need? So, how to build a Sabbath? It means this. Well, I'll answer the question this way. Um, you start by practicing. You start by like setting aside the time, and once you've done it, then spend some time reflecting on it. This is why I serve as a coach. This is why Sabbath. I'm sorry. Why coaching and spiritual direction I think are so important for this season is because once you've attempted Sabbath, it's really helpful to process with someone else. Hey, this worked, this didn't work. What can I do next? And have someone help you get some altitude on your own life, so that as you are practicing this thing to become acquainted with your own soul and with God again, you've got some, you have a partner in the creativity, in the creation of the Sabbath day. There isn't a way to do it. There are questions in at the heart of the Sabbath practice that we get to answer, and then honestly, it's like raising a child. I think there's that moment in which, like, oh, I feel like I've got this thing. I figured out 5 years old. Well, now they're 6. By the time you figure out 5, now they're 6. By the time I figured out in a season what it is my soul needs, like, I've changed. My circumstances have changed, and then I get to now pay attention to my soul again. What the Sabbath does over time is it actually trains me to pay attention to my soul more regularly, and it organizes my emotional relationship to the rest of my days. So, how do you build a Sabbath? You try it. You give some things a shot, and then you work with a coach or a spiritual director, not just about building the thing, but also how to in paying attention to your soul and how you're responding to rest and the days around the day of rest. Now, I posted a thing. This is the second question. I posted a thing recently after watching a conversation between a couple folks who are posing themselves as experts um, about deconstruction. And one of the phrases that kept coming up was, "After I deconstruct dead," and more than one person in this conversation said that. So what I posted to Instagram, and it's about as snarky as I get nowadays, is I look forward to people deconstructing from the rampant misuse of the word deconstruction. Here's why this thing gets under my skin. It's not just because, like, I have a philosophical background, my days in academia. It bugs me for that reason to some degree, but I'm not just being an elitist. Deconstruction is not that I changed my mind. That's not what deconstruction is. That just means I changed my mind. Deconstruction is a philosophical word that was used by Jacques Derrida to describe the fundamental reposturing of my interpretive self and my interpretive relationship to the world. And what Derrida was chasing with deconstruction was this: that at some point we've become disillusioned enough with our search for meaning, that what we come to is that meaning is either just elusive and cannot be found, or it simply doesn't exist. And that language poisons our pursuit of this thing by obscuring the absence of meaning. In other words, there is no center, there is no meaning, and we begin in deconstruction. My posture shifts, and the posture of someone who actually lives in deconstruction is there is no meaning to be found. That is the primary assumption of deconstruction, is that there is no meaning to be found. And then the second part of deconstruction is exactly this: that what all language does is it obscures that absence, and I pretend with these words, I pretend that there is meaning, and I build with language, because of my emotional attachment to language. I build with language this sense of meaning, which just obscures the absence of meaning. The way we have gone about talking about deconstruction in the last 10 plus years is not actually deconstruction, because what most folks that I'm hearing are doing is moving from one set of conclusions about how life is to a new set of conclusions that this is actually true. This, I thought this was true. This is untrue because now I know that this is true. Now, that's a fantastic thing, but that's not deconstruction, because all you've done, and it's a good thing, what you've done is you've moved from a set of conclusions to another set of conclusions. Here's why the use of the word deconstruction bugs me about this. One, that's just maturity. I hope that by the time, if you believe certain things when you were in your 20s, I hope you believe different things when you're in your 30s and then in your 40s and your 50s, just because you're growing. And when we use the word deconstruction, we sort of disparage the natural process of just growth and maturity. And it seems like I've done something like extraordinary by changing my mind about how the world is. And the reality is that's not extraordinary at all. That's everybody. Literally everyone goes through that. It's simply maturity. It's simply the change of one's mind. When we use a word like deconstruction to describe that, we create this elitist space in which I have deconstructed and other people have not. And now there's this line between me, emotionally and socially, between me and other people. Which brings me to the second part. When we use the word deconstruction to talk about growth and change, here's the thing we obscure. This is part of what Derrida was after. We obscure what's actually going on, which is that for a lot of folks who talk about deconstruction, there are things we believe are destructive in the world. There are ways people have gone about living, and we used to be part of them, and we are trying to distance ourselves from those things. That this thing that used to be true, for me, I no longer believe, and now I recognize it as a threat. And when I talk about deconstruction, once I've said I've deconstructed, I'm creating this elitist barrier between myself and my past self, which I think is problematic. I'm creating this elitist barrier between myself and other people who disagree with me or live the way I used to live, which leads to the next piece. One of the deepest problems I have with the deconstruction culture and communication around deconstruction is exactly the disparagement of our past, your past and other people's past. There probably are things about your past that were not good, and there are conclusions that you used to come to that you should move on from. That's just maturity and that's growth, and I hope you continue to grow. But when we frame our growth in deconstruction, we disparage our past. And here's something I'm going to assume. Here's a risk I'm going to take. I'm going to assume some things are true that you don't like. That you don't like that they're true. Is in the past, when you did believe those things, and when your world was constricted by this set of beliefs, that was actually probably good for you for your time. There were things about your past there were things about your philosophical, social, religious past that were actually good for you at the time. And there were boundaries, or there were conclusions, there were handles in life that you were able to hold to, or those things that were holding you in place for that season. And it was actually a positive thing. And just because you grew out of those out of that clothing, just because you grew out of that, doesn't mean you have to or even should turn around and call that thing in whole and mass a negative. I think that creates fissures in our psychological selves when we look back on our past and we think like, that person was trash, that person was an idiot, I'm so glad I deconstructed and moved on from them. And we disparage the good gifts we were given just because they're gifts that don't work for the season we're in. What Derrida did with deconstruction was ask us to reposture ourselves, was asking people to reposture themselves with the assumption that there was no meaning. There is no meaning. And language obscures the absence of meaning by creating false senses of connection with things. That's what he was actually up to. What most of us are doing is just growing and learning and maturing. And we can do that together, and we can do that with more grace than is often offered in deconstruction circles. The last piece is this. It might be true for you, if you're using the word deconstruction, that you really have come to begun to assume that there is nothing true, that there is no truth at the center of things, and that words obscure the absence of meaning by creating false connections. If that's where you are, here's the reality about deconstruction. One does not simply deconstruct, period, and then move on. Deconstruction is a posture. It's a posture. It's a way. It's a life-sized hermeneutic. It's a way in which I look at the world around me and I pay attention differently. It's a posture I live in. I don't deconstruct and come to the end of that process. I lean into a different posture of relationship to the world around me and I live there. It's a posture and not a conclusion. And if that's where you are, it's a really serious and can be really fraught with peril place to be. It's something, and it is a position and a posture that is far more serious and deserves far more seriousness than a lot of the language and the culture that we've designed around it in the deconstruction culture. So some of the messages I got were like, can you elaborate on like what your problem is with the way we talk about deconstruction? And there you go. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the @C podcast. Until next time.